morning, everybody. Good morning. It's so good to see all of you. The song just said, "Be exalted, O God, amongst the nations." We are excited to give God glory together on this Juneteenth. I tell you, a national holiday now. How exciting, how excited we are to have this opportunity to come together on this beautiful Saturday morning to really focus in on a subject that's so tremendously important. And of course, how fortuitous when we, Deacon Michael Perrilliat and his committee talked about when to have this event. We talked about the significance of Juneteenth, but my goodness, I don't think Deacon Perrilliat and his team had any idea that today would actually be now a national holiday. Somebody ought to just put your hands together, snap, 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 clap, 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 or something right where you are, because this was a long, long time coming. I am so thrilled to see all of you on this Saturday, Juneteenth, the 19th, 2021. I'm going to be your host and moderator, Reverend Cynthia Carter-Perrilliat, Executive Director of the Alameda County Care Alliance, and of course, an ordained minister at the wonderful, historic Allen Temple Baptist Church. Yes, indeed. How thrilling it is to be with all of you today. Hey, we've got a wonderful, wonderful program in store for you today. And we know that this will be time that is well spent. Our goal is that you walk away from this seminar, this symposium, this childhood trauma symposium webinar with tools and tips and ideas as we continue to explore with these amazing experts more about this subject of childhood trauma. Before we get started, is our wonderful and illustrious Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, our pastor, on the call as yet?
Good morning.
There she is. Why don't we just give a snap, snap, clap, clap, and a wave our hand for our wonderful pastor, Dr. Jacqueline Thompson. We know that our pastor is a visionary leader, and she was thrilled in working with Deacon Michael Perrilliat and his team in conception of this idea. We know that our children are so important, our young adults are so important, and she thought that this was an amazing idea, and we so appreciate her presence and her support. So I'm going to pass the baton to our pastor, Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, to open us up.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Reverend Cynthia Perrilliat. It is certainly my pleasure to greet you on this wonderful day, this sunshiny day. Happy Juneteenth to all of you who are joining us. We're certainly excited to delve into a topic that is so relevant and so needed. So thank you to all of our guests today, to Dr. Long and to Dr. Grandison and Ms. Carlisle, who will be giving you stellar presentations, and certainly to the Perrilliats, the dynamic duo, who have helped pull this together with Allen Temple Baptist Church and the Alameda County Care Alliance, and all of you who are joining us today. This fall, our children will be returning back to school, and this has been a traumatic year for all of us, especially them. And so I think it's important that we are equipped to be able to handle everything that might come with them trying to return to a new sense of whatever normal is going to be. And so we certainly thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to a wonderful and a dynamic presentation. And once again, we thank you, Reverend Cynthia, and your wonderful team, and Deacon Michael Perrilliat as well, for helping to pull this symposium together.
Thank you so much, Pastor Thompson. We really appreciate you this morning and your amazing leadership. I'd like to also ask Deacon Michael Perrilliat, as chairman of our deacon board and one of the certainly leaders of pulling this important really dream and vision together. We'd love to hear from you this morning, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm so moved this morning that we are having this childhood trauma symposium. It is a very important subject matter. Our youth are being impacted significantly all over this country and all over the world, and particularly those who are Black and brown ethnicities. And so we have just a wonderful group of presenters today, and I'm just so blessed and honored that they were so thoughtful in their consideration to be a part of this symposium And so I'm so thankful for each and every one of you who have participated and who have joined us today. So God bless you, and thank you.
Thank you, Deacon Michael Perrilliat. So let's go ahead and just really for a moment contemplate the moment. And again, thank all of you for participating on this important symposium for our community. So many of you know that June 19th has long represented a day in this country where African Americans have celebrated Juneteenth. And of course, this recognition of what occurred back in 1865 when the news of the ending of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, landed in Galveston, Texas, was literally 2 years after slavery had quote unquote ended in January 1st of 1863. And I like to say, as the saying goes, it's better late than never. And that would certainly be true of the fact that Congress, literally an act of Congress and the signing of our president, even this week, marks the celebration also not only of Juneteenth, but we have to be honest and speak about the devastation and the trauma that slavery has had on Black people in particular in this country. So how important and fortuitous, I believe, in the timing of this workshop, given the fact that COVID-19 has just ramshacked our communities. Those of us that are people of color know that Blacks and Browns in particular have been impacted by health inequities and health disparities for many, many years. So Allen Temple and the ACC, the Alameda County Carolines, is pleased to come together to really have this important symposium. And before we move forward, I'd ask if everyone could please mute yourself other than our next speaker, but that would be very helpful in terms of making sure that we have a smooth flow and continuity in our presentations. And so thank you once again for your participation and cooperation. It's just amazing that we have all of these parents and grandparents, pastors, faith leaders, our broad community engaged in this important issue. And literally we want to build hope, capacity, but how about resilience and healing for our precious children and young people, particularly people of color. So today we're going to have 3 speaker presentations from the experts: Dr. Carina Grandison, Miss Lisa Carlisle, and Dr. Dayna Long. And additionally, we're going to have 1 young adult panelist to participate also, and that's our wonderful Nathaniel Goodlow. And he'll participate in our Q&A along with our 3 speaker presenters. So that being said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Carina Grandison. I'd like to share a little bit about her bio. So Dr. Carina Grandison, PhD, has been practicing for over 25 years, conducting neuropsychological assessment of children, adolescents, and young adults with brain injuries, as well as neurocognitive learning and developmental disorders. Dr. Grandison is an assistant clinical professor at UC Berkeley Psychology Clinic, where she teaches and supervises advanced graduate students. Dr. Grandison was the director of neuropsychology assessment service at the Oakland Children's Hospital and on faculty at UCSF Department of Psychiatry. Following her postdoctoral training at the Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, she has practiced at Massachusetts General Hospital as a clinical instructor at the Harvard Medical School before moving to California to join the staff at UCSF. So Dr. Grandison, have you got your slides up? We're going to be hearing from her in just a moment, but let's give her some snaps, some claps, and welcome Dr. Carina Grandison to talk to us on the subject of childhood trauma. Dr. Grandison? Let's just give her a moment. We're getting the technical details. And you can unmute yourself, Dr. Grandison.
All right, very good. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that introduction. So I will talk with you today about children and trauma from the perspective of what little children need for life to go well and what happens when trauma is introduced to a little person's life and what specifically happens to the child's brain. That's my bailiwick. When I found this little newborn picture, I wanted to put it up front and center because that's where we all start. We all come into this world, regardless of where we are born, regardless of country, regardless of everything. We all have been right there where this little person is. And that's also where I start my job, my daily job. My job is to try to understand what happens to little people and what do they need so that life can go a little bit better. So I always start with the newborn. That's where I started my studies, to learn how development goes when development goes the way it should go. So my next slide is this one. So I want to talk about little people, little babies, what they need. We all know that they need food, lots of it. We all know that they need diaper changes, many of them. And we all know that they need warmth, they need clothing, they need housing. But I would venture to say that as important as all those needs are, the baby's need for love and the baby's need for relationship is as important. Little babies, when they are born, they have few but very powerful ways of communicating. One of the ways in which they communicate is by screaming and crying. And we may think of that as a nuisance factor because it's hard to listen to a baby's cry, but nevertheless the baby cries so that we hear and pay attention to the baby. It's a very powerful way of being in the world because it calls the adults to pay attention. Little babies' brains have already grown a lot in utero, inside the mommy's tummy, but the little baby's brain keeps on growing a lot, especially in the first 5 years of life. The baby's brain grows at an incredible rate. We have in our brains about 100 billion neurons. Neurons are the little connecting pieces in the brain that make it all happen. And these grow at an exponential rate when the baby is just a little tiny thing. We used to think of babies perhaps incorrectly as little pieces of dough, little pieces of clay, little blank slates that are coming into the world with not much. We were very wrong because we now know that the little baby comes into the world with a lot of powerful tools. The baby who cries and gets attended to learns that, oh, my cry leads to somebody coming to my aid, and that leads to me with a good feeling. Oh, and if I smile, wow, look at all these people around me, they smile back. That is very, very powerful. And you know, if I start to coo, others start to coo back at me. I am a very important person. I am powerful. Little babies learn that when they do something and you do it back to them, they learn the power of imitation. I coo, you coo, wow, we're cooing together. I am now imitating you and you are imitating me. The world is now a good place. The world is a place where I can feel safe, where I can have power, and my needs are being met by these people around me. That is a very good feeling. I do have my moments of stress because my hunger is really working my last nerve and I've got to cry. But my stress hormones that kick in when I scream, they get taken care of so that I get a little taste of stress, but it doesn't override. It doesn't last so long. It goes away and all is good. So I get used to a little stress, but I can see that it's not a lasting feeling. And at the end of all of those kinds of experiences, the little baby feels like I belong. And that's what we all need to have as a basis of our life. We need to feel like we belong. And since I belong, I feel good. Now I can start to look around and focus and learn. And I can really learn a lot about the world. And I have a feeling that the world is a good place. That's what it is when it goes well. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't always go so well. The picture here is one that has been etched into my mind. It's a picture from a Romanian orphanage from 1989, when Ceausescu had been the leader of the country, and he had put lots and lots and lots of little newborn babies into orphanages. The world didn't know, but the world found out when the country's really strong government was overthrown in 1989. There are some stories about how when the journalists entered into all of these orphanages, nearly 200,000 babies were kept in them. And one of the articles I read talked about how quiet it was. There were babies lined up like sardine cans in cribs, and they were all entirely quiet. And that, of course, brings us back to what I just talked about, how the power of the cry is one of the ways in which babies communicate. And when the baby's cry isn't responded to, the baby goes quiet. This whole thing about these Romanian orphanage babies being found in orphanages really woke up many, many people around the world to how it isn't enough to give food and clothing to babies, because these babies were fed. They were fed by given bottles through their cribs. They were clothed and they were dressed, but they didn't have human relationships in their lives. These babies turned out to have smaller brains. They couldn't relate socially. They were very, very injured. And to this day, there are over 2 million babies still in orphanages around the world. So this is just to help us understand that little ones are actually more vulnerable to trauma than older people. We all are. We are all vulnerable to trauma. But when we are little, like these babies, and we don't yet have a way of talking and even remembering it with the help of words, it really permeates all of us. It affects us from top to toe, all the way from our physiological selves to our psychological selves. It's harder to go through trauma that you can't even verbalize. So I'd like to bust the myth of thinking that, oh, little people, they are too young to be affected. They are too young to even remember. The opposite is true. The younger babies are more affected than anyone else. So let me take you to the next one. So the list of trauma, of course, is very, very long. There are lots and lots and lots of ways that little people and big people can get traumatized. Sometimes trauma is caused by other human beings, such as the picture I just showed you, where the country's leader put babies into orphanages. We, of course, can list many, many ways in which humans hurt humans and have done so throughout the history of our earth. That is a tragedy that keeps on happening. We know that there are trauma that's caused by Mother Nature, such as when a tsunami hits, or such as when the earth is shaking, or such as when a wildfire is hitting you, such as when a flood is hitting you. In my office, I have seen children affected by all of these kinds of traumas. I saw children from the Santa Barbara floods who had been sleeping in their homes, who woke up with flood around them and actually nearly drowning. Sometimes trauma is one horrific event, such as a drowning experience. Sometimes it's chronic, such as the little child who goes home and there is mental illness perhaps, or there is alcoholism, or there is some dysfunction in the family that makes it the air that you breathe. There's certainly trauma that happens in the homes. There's trauma that happens in the schools. I have seen many children who have been so bullied in their schools that they have attempted suicide, or they have become so devastated that they can't even go to school anymore. So trauma happens in the home with our loved ones. It happens at school. It happens in society for sure. The trauma can be physical, such as too much physical corporal punishment for little people. Trauma can be emotional, such as hearing the worst things being said to you. Trauma can be abusive, trauma can be neglectful. Sometimes the neglect is even worse than the physical abuse, because when you have neglect, you have a lack of human connection, which is what little babies cannot tolerate. In a physical abusive situation, you have a connection, although of course it is harmful. Now, all of these, regardless of the cause, they all affect our brains, because now when you are being faced with trauma, regardless of the type, your stress hormones kick in. And when all has been well so far in your life, the stress hormones may go away and you may overcome it, but not always so. This is a quick tour into our brain, just a quick little visit so that you can get a feel for what happens to your brain when you are traumatized. I'm picking out 3 parts because they are crucial parts, just to show you that trauma affects us at very different levels. It affects our what's called amygdala. Amygdala is that tiny little almond-shaped piece in the middle of our brain. It's truly the size of an almond. This is the place there that is very good for us to have, because the amygdala is the one that registers threat. This would be, for instance, the pit bull coming running at you. We all know that immediately our body goes into a hyper alert state when the pit bull comes running. You get ready to react. The reaction might be to run as fast as you can, or if you're strong and mighty, maybe even attack the one that's causing the threat for you. This is also the feeling that you have when you look over a very steep cliff. We all have maybe peaked a little bit and get that rush of feeling. That is your amygdala doing its good job of sounding the alarm bell to tell you, hey, watch out, something bad is happening. What do you need to do? You need to do something. You can't just do nothing because your life is at stake. So this is the one that helps you read the fear around you. Thank God we have it. I was just reading an article about a man whose amygdala had been removed because he had a certain neurological condition, and his life became very difficult because he did not protect himself like he had prior to the surgery. He would be the one who wouldn't realize that don't take another step closer to the cliff, because the alarm system wasn't ringing its bells in his brain. Another part that's very handy for us is the hippocampus. Down here, you see the word hippocampus. Hippocampus is a fancy sort of twist of the word seahorse. It's this white squiggly part in the middle that has the shape of a seahorse. Hippocampus is wonderful because hippocampus is sort of the coordinator of your memories. Your memories are now organized. Your memories, you can find them again when you need them. You can go back and know that they are memories as opposed to current events. The hippocampus keeps track of current versus past. Now, when you have too much stress happening, too much of toxic stress happening, your hippocampus actually becomes damaged. And now your memory becomes all wonky. You might overly well remember some events that come back to you as flashbacks. On the other hand, your memory, when you're supposed to be learning in school, might not do its job. So now your hippocampus is messing with you because memories are too well recalled, or you can't form new memories. So hippocampus is wonderful when it's working, and a problem when it gets overly flooded with too much stress hormone. The prefrontal cortex, which is here, that's sort of right behind your own eyes. That's the prefrontal cortex, a very smart place, because this is the place that actually can stop action. It can stop your thoughts. It can stop your feelings. It can basically put the stop sign in front of something that otherwise would take over. It's also the part of your brain that allows you to switch from one thing to another, so that when you're in school, you can do a little math. The teacher tells you to put away the math book, and now you can switch to the next subject, because the switching that you need to do throughout the day is happening so well. It really regulates your emotions and it regulates your thinking. A very good handy-dandy place for regulating yourself. It also can stop the amygdala from going cuckoo. It can say, that's enough, we got it, stop it. So the prefrontal cortex is like a big traffic sign in the brain. Now, when all is well, the amygdala sounds the alarm. The hippocampus it reminds us of what the memories are, and the prefrontal cortex can sort of regulate all that so that it all stays okay. Now, when we have too much happening, when we have, like Dayna will talk about, too many ACEs, adverse childhood events, that's the fancy measurement of how much trauma is coming in. When you have too much of that coming in, when you have too big of an event coming in, it really does mess up these three stations in the brain that's supposed to regulate you and help you function well. When all of these circuits, these three places, are overloaded, overstressed, the stress hormones are messing with them, it does rewire your brain. In the situation that we all have seen where something bad happens, luckily, many times we can get over it. We can get over the bad things in our lives. Otherwise, we would all be walking PTSDs. Luckily, we have a system in our brain that can help us. And that goes back to the childhood that we talked about. When you have enough in you to know that the world is gonna be all right, you can fortunately overcome much. But if it's too much, it's too much. If it's too big, it's too big. And now the initial reaction that you had when the pit bull came running towards you becomes your way of being. So you have a constant feeling of, am I going to fight or am I going to run away? Because you cannot trust that the pit bull will go away. You have to be in a constant state of alert. So the brain has now become rewired. And the kinds of symptoms that you see of a brain that has now become rewired is a brain that has a hard time relaxing. You have sleep being one of the main effects of too much trauma in your life. You can't fall asleep. You have insomnia. And when you do fall asleep, you have nightmares because the images come back to haunt you over and over again. And your hippocampus can't tell you, wait, that was long ago, let it go, it's old. No, it feels new. It feels new every time it comes at you. Your emotions are now affected because one thing we do know is that if you don't sleep well, you have a hard time with your emotions. You have a hard time learning. You have a hard time keeping your eyes open in class. So learning becomes a problem. And the hippocampus isn't helping you storing those memories. So you're sitting there overly anxious, overly tired, and you cannot take in the new information. It also affects, as we learned from the little babies, it affects how you see the world. Is the world safe or is the next danger lurking behind the corner? Do you feel good or do you feel like something bad is about to happen? So one of the things I often talk about when I see kids and when I go to schools to talk about my findings is that we need to stop looking at most kids as simply behaving badly. The kid who doesn't listen, the kid who doesn't sit straight, the kid who doesn't obey the teacher, the kid who kicks the other kid during recess, the kid who is behaving badly. Instead of looking at little kids as badly behaving people who need to be stopped from behaving badly by punishment and by other things, we need to instead remember, I believe, the little baby who was crying. As annoying as it is when the baby cries, it is a signal, it is communication. I need something. Can you please step in and be the one who helps me feel regulated? So I believe strongly that we have to ask ourselves, when little people don't behave well, when little people have a hard time, we have to ask ourselves, what is this kid actually communicating? Is this kid talking to me? Is this kid telling me maybe, just maybe, there's some trauma behind it? I'm not saying that we can know that every badly behaving kid has been traumatized. That would be a way too big of a statement that probably isn't true. But we need to have good questions that guide us. We need to ask, what can I do? What can I listen to? What do I need to learn about this child's experience so that I can see what the behavior might be connected to? So thank you for listening to all of that. I have a couple of places that I like to go to. These are places I go when I need to refresh myself when it comes to trauma. One book that just came out that I really recommend for you because I love it. It's written by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. Dr. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist who has been around talking about trauma for 20 plus years. I love the title of the book, What Happened to You? Because instead of saying, what's wrong with you, which is the instinctual question we often ask kids, what's wrong with you? Why don't you X, Y, Z? Instead, we should remind ourselves to ask, what happened to this kid? The kid might not be able to tell you, especially if things happened before they even had language, because trauma pre-verbal is so hard for little people to explain because they don't have the words for it. But we should ask ourselves, what happened to you? Another place that I love to go on the internet, and you can click away and get 15 minutes of great education, is by looking at Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's TED Talks. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is our very own Surgeon General. Our state is, I think, maybe the only one that has a Surgeon General. She is a wonderful pediatrician who makes it very plain for us all to understand, how does trauma affect our health? And it does. It affects our blood pressure. It affects our heart, our kidneys, our diabetic conditions. It affects us in very, very many ways. Another book that I have on my nightstand, I go back to it frequently, is The Body Keeps the Score. This is a psychiatrist who talks about how trauma, for all of the different reasons that I've laid out for you, how it really affects the very basic body of yours, how it affects how your physiology is reacting. So one of my take-home lessons when I read all of these people and listen to them is that trauma affects you from your body all the way through your mind and into your soul and how you perceive the world. So I am done with my talk. Thank you very much, and eager to hear the next person presenting.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Carina Grandison. You gave us some very impactful and important points to focus on the physiology of trauma and how it impacts the brain, and particularly the focus on babies. Thank you for that. You gave us a lot to think about, and we're looking forward to your engagement with us in the panel discussion that will follow Lisa and Dr. Dayna. So thank you so much. So next we're going to hear from Lisa Carlisle. Why did I say your name wrong, Lisa? And I know your name very well. Lisa is another dynamo, and I'd like to share her biography as well. So Lisa Carlisle currently serves as the director of the Child and Youth Adult System of Care with the Alameda County Behavioral Health Department. Ms. Carlisle provides leadership for 6 subdivisions delivering services to children, youth, and young adults between the ages of 0 to 24 years of age living in Alameda County. Over the past 20 years, Ms. Carlisle has been privileged to work with and on behalf of children, youth, young adults, and families, those in need of mental health services and supports in a variety of educational and mental health settings. Ms. Lisa enjoys community engagements and opportunities such as this today that really allow her the opportunity to provide information and mental health information, as well as focus on wellness, issues around stress factors, and the impact of complex trauma and recovery, and certainly resilience. That being said, we look forward to hearing from Ms. Lisa Carlisle.
Good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen. And I'm going to be speaking with you all today a little bit of part two with regard to what Dr. Carina covered in terms of stress and trauma in children and youth. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the daily activity and function that happens as a result of some of the brain science and trauma that Dr. Carina covered. So for today, we're really going to be focusing on defining stress and trauma, exploring types of stress, and examining the impact of chronic stress and complex trauma. And again, we're going to be focusing on children, youth, and young adults. A lot of the information that I'll cover will be applicable, of course, to adults and older adults, but I'm really going to be focusing on how those things impact child development, and expanding just a bit on some of those brain developmental factors that Dr. Carina spoke about. So first, I want to just really define what is mental health. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, how we relate to others, and how we make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. Now, what you'll see in this definition is that you will see an absence of mental disorders. So I always like to make sure that when we talk about mental health, it is not defined by the absence or presence of a mental illness. And that's very important. Oftentimes when we think of mental health, we go directly to mental illness or mental health challenges. But again, mental health is really a holistic approach that looks at the whole person in their entirety. And next, I want to talk about just a little bit about, well, what about mental health disorders? A mental illness is a condition that affects a person's thinking, feeling, behavior, and mood. And I like to put this in three categories: the live, laugh, and love. And one of the distinctions, especially for children and youth, that defines, that can be a marker for the difference between what's happening just in regular child and adolescent development to what might be developing into some mental health challenges, are those three categories. Is it impacting the youth's ability to live and perform their daily activities? Is it impacting their ability to laugh, which means enjoy things? And then love, also maintaining relationships or building new relationships. So I just want to go over a little bit of data. And this is current data. It's from the National Alliance of Mental Health, which is called NAMI. And these are statistics that are specific to the United States. And I think it's important that we take a look at it. 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness each year. 1 in 20 adults in the United States experience serious mental illness each year. 1 in 6 youth in the United States between the ages of 6 and 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by age 14 and 75 by the age of 24. Now, we call this early onset, that between the ages of 14 and 24. That's when most mental illnesses show up. However, they typically go untreated and either undiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or misdiagnosed for 10 years. So if you're looking at an individual or a young person who has the onset of a mental health disorder that starts at around the age of 16 or 17, that's not really recognized until they're 27, they've had 10 years of the firing and wiring of their brain with the amygdala, the frontal lobe, and the hippocampus that has rewired their stress responses to things. And so again, if you have untreated and undiagnosed mental illness, by the time it is recognized 10 years later, that young person has been suffering for a decade, and their health outcomes are impacted, and also their quality of life may have been severely impacted. So some of the major factors that contribute to mental health problems include biological factors, genetics and brain chemistry, excuse me, life experiences such as trauma and abuse, and family history of mental health problems. So next, I want to talk a little bit about signs and symptoms, particularly because we're talking about children and youth, and it may be a challenge to differentiate what is typical child and youth adolescent behavior, and what are some things that parents, caregivers, or community members might want to give what I like to say a cause for pause. So the signs and symptoms, people may expect that a person with serious mental illness may look different from others, and that's not the case. And, oftentimes people that are suffering from mental health disorders, they don't look ill. They don't have, a look, so to speak, about them. And, also it's not something, having a mental health challenge or serious mental illness is not something that you can just get over, or you can will your way through it. Or if you had a stronger personality, you wouldn't be impacted. Or if you weren't as lazy, you wouldn't be as impacted. So it's not something that you can just snap your fingers and it goes away. These misconceptions just add to the ongoing stigma and, challenges with individuals seeking out mental health support. And also, social inequity has been associated with the risk of developing mental health challenges, in particular because social inequity feeds into chronic stress and toxic stress, and also complex trauma, which can trigger mental health disorders, or if someone is already having mental health challenges, that additional stress and trauma can make those symptoms much more acute. So in children and youth, and some of this is taken from the mental health first aid curriculum. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just something that may be helpful when you're working with children and youth, either in your communities and congregation, in your home, or even in your classroom. So I'm going to go over just a few things that I'm going to take some time to linger on a couple because it's important. The first is an unusually sad mood. Next is lack of energy and tiredness. Now, I want to just pause a bit there because lack of energy and tiredness can also just be associated with poor sleep, or, you've had your young person that's been, that stayed up all night playing the PlayStation or the Xbox or whatever that is. So that in itself is not a marker for, necessarily a marker for the onset of mental illness. And also hormonal changes can also impact energy and tiredness, and so can nutrition. So again, that alone is not a marker, but when you see that over prolonged periods of time with other interventions that are in place. So if you have a young person that's up all night, on an electronic device, and you have them power down at 10, you also change their eating habits and make sure that they're eating a healthy breakfast or snack or lunch. If you're providing some of those interventions and the lack of energy and tiredness persists, then that might be something that you can go to your pediatrician about to see if there is something physical happening there in terms of primary care. And if those things have been ruled out, then you might want to look at some of these other things along with that to see if that is impacting a young person's health and wellness. Next is having trouble sleeping. I talked a little bit about that. Isolating from friends and family. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this because when young people reach that sweet spot of kind of ages 13 through 17, part of the child developmental process is isolating from family members and becoming into your own. So you're wanting to identify a little bit less with your family, and you want to identify more with peers or more with things, in your age group or more with friends. So isolating in itself is not something to be alarmed about. When there's isolating from friends and family with no replacement relationships, that might be something that you want to look into. So you have a young person who's isolating from their family, which could be, again, developmentally appropriate, but they're isolating from friends and family, and they're not engaging in new relationships with friends. So they're not, introducing another peer group, and they're isolating from all the relationships that they have. That's something that you may want to look into. If the door is always closed and never open, knock on the door, check on your young person and say, hey, what's your temperature today? Is it warm? Is it sunny? Is it cloudy? Is it raining? Just a quick temperature check. Sometimes young people don't want to talk about a lot of things, or they don't want you in their business, but it's our responsibility to be in their business. We don't have to be intrusive with it, but we can, open the door, so to speak, and do a temperature check and just see how our young people are doing. Next is lack of interest in activities that used to be enjoyable. Again, this is also part of normal adolescent development. You have children that when they're, 4, 5, and 6, maybe they play with Tonka trucks, or they might play with dolls, or they might play with Legos. But by the time they're 12 or 13, they may have given that up for video games. So it's not necessarily cause for alarm if activities are being replaced and things that were enjoyable are not enjoyable. One of the things we want to pay attention to is if we notice our young people, our children, adolescents, and even young adults, if they are beginning to give up all of those activities that they have been interested in, and they don't have replacement activities. So if you play basketball or you run track or football and you no longer do that, but you don't have a new thing, maybe you don't want to play basketball anymore and you're into robotics and that's your thing. So if you're noticing that, the young people in your lives are no longer engaging in those activities that used to bring them joy, and there are no new activities, no new interests, that might be something to pay attention to, because you look at the lack of activities. You also look at the isolation that's happening. You can look at the mood. Those three things in themselves hit those three items that I talked about earlier, that live, laugh, love. So that engagement, that being able to enjoy, and then, developing those relationships. The other item is obsessive compulsive behavior, and I want to spend just a little bit on that. That does not mean that someone is, a neat freak. Okay, so if someone likes things to be clean, that's not obsessive compulsive behavior. The distinction is when someone has obsessive compulsive behavior, that inhibits their ability to maybe move on to another activity until a particular activity is done to perfection. And for someone that's suffering with obsessive compulsive behavior, it might take them 45 minutes every day to get dressed, because they spent the first 20 minutes making up their bed. And by making up their bed, I mean making sure the pillow is arranged, things are folded just so, and if it's not right, they have to start over. And they can't physically move to the next activity until this activity is done in perfection. You may also see youth on the autism spectrum disorder that might have repetitive behaviors that might be obsessive or compulsive. You might have a young person that goes up and down the stairs. They go up 1 stair, down 2, go up 3 stairs, down 4. That's their process. And they can't go up the stairs until they've done that pattern. So if you're noticing different patterns of behavior that are repetitive, that are hindering a young person from moving on to the next activity, that might be something to pay attention to. I'm going to speed through these just a little bit because I want to get into more of the stress and trauma. Unrealistic and or excessive fear and worry. As Dr. Carina mentioned, some fear and worry is important. That's part of what that amygdala does. It it triggers you where it says, okay, you're at the edge of a cliff. Are you going to jump or back up? And your hippocampus says, no, you need to back up. And your, the amygdala says you need to back up. And your hippocampus remembers those string of activities. So, fear and worry is not abnormal, but if it is excessive and again, hinders someone's ability to function, enjoy activities, or maintain relationships, that's something to pay attention to. And, you know, you might say, this sounds like every teenager I know. There are young people that have, you know, smatterings of these things that I've mentioned. But again, those things in isolation aren't necessarily a marker for mental health challenges. But when you have a few of those items present and they are impacting, again, those three areas that live, laugh, love, pay attention. And then lastly here, I've highlighted again, 1 in every 6 children within the age group of 2 to 8 years of age have some or other neurodevelopmental, behavioral, or emotional difficulty. And Dr. Carina spoke about that earlier in terms of early childhood. So, you know, next I want to talk a little bit about stress. And, you know, I have up here, well, is stress a mental illness? Stress by itself is not a mental illness, but it doesn't help mental illness. It doesn't make it better, and it can make symptoms more acute. So when we look at the American Psychological Association, how they define stress, stress by definition is an uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, and behavior changes. And again, that's the very thing that Dr. Carina spoke about earlier. And predictable biochemical changes, physiological and behavioral changes, that's important. So I'm going to talk about the types of stress. Oh, I'm sorry. There are, you know, really 3 categories of stress that impact all individuals. And positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. Positive stress is moderate and brief and generally a normal part of life. And it's a healthy part of development. A healthy stress might be starting a new job or buying a new car or starting a new relationship or, you know, all of those new things. You might have a little anxiousness about it, but it passes and you're able to recover. Tolerable stress includes events that have the potential to alter the developing brain negatively. And that can be failing a class or not passing an exam. You go to an audition or you try it for a team and you don't make it. It is tolerable, but when you have frequent instances of tolerable stress, it does rewire the brain. So your brain fires and wires its responses and reactions to things according to the experiences that you have. So when you move over to toxic stress, this includes strong, frequent, and prolonged activity of the body's stress response. And toxic stress is constant and often unrelenting in nature. And some of the examples of this are chronic abuse and neglect, chronic medical conditions, prolonged incarceration. For children and youth, when I say prolonged incarceration, I'm particularly talking about prolonged incarceration of a primary caregiver, because that is not only toxic stress for the incarcerated parent or caregiver, it's toxic stress for the child and family that's left behind. Another example of toxic stress could be domestic violence that a youth is either victim to or witness of. And again, that's chronic and unrelenting. And toxic stress also rewires your brain. So when you're constantly exposed to stress, your response time changes to a reaction, and you're reacting to everything. And I like to go back to Dr. Carina's visual for the brain. I like to do the brain like this. So if you look at this, this is the prefrontal cortex. The thumb here is the amygdala, and here is the hippocampus in this area. The frontal lobe is protecting everything. And when this gets rewired, it starts exposing your amygdala. And so that is what gets rewired. And then it changes what I like to also call your muscle memory, that hippocampus, because you are now remembering to respond to everything as a reaction to the stress. And it really turns off kind of that thinking part, that regulation area, especially with children use, because their brains are developing. Their brains may develop to only react and not respond. And that's important. There's a distinction between the two. So we're going to move on to trauma. And what is trauma? Trauma is any type of distressing event or experience that can have an impact on a person's ability to cope and function. Trauma can result in emotional, physical, and psychological harm. Dr. Carina spoke about brain trauma, or excuse me, traumatic brain injury. That usually happens when there is some type of physical accident. There may be a car accident. There may be a number of things. So I'm not necessarily talking about traumatic brain injury. I'm more talking about the trauma in terms of life experiences that have that emotional and psychological damage, but it can also impact physical health as well. But trauma has no boundaries. It is not a respecter of persons. It does not care about your age, where you live, what your zip code is, your gender, your educational level. Every person can be impacted by trauma. And everyone's reaction to a traumatic event is not the same. And, I want to pause a little bit. I know you all have had the experience of either watching a movie or going to the movies with someone, and you all watch the same movie and you walk away with two different critiques of the movie, and you walk away with two different summaries of the movie, even though you both saw the same film. Same thing with trauma. There can be young people that are witness to a traumatic event, but their response to it is not the same. It affects each young person differently. And you can't assume that because one young person didn't have a strong reaction to something, that everyone else didn't. Or that a young person that did have a strong reaction, everyone else is going to have a strong reaction. So again, trauma impacts everyone differently, and everyone doesn't experience it at the same levels. So what are the types of trauma? And here are just some examples. Physical and sexual abuse, natural or man-made disasters or acts of God. I know Dr. Carina spoke about that. Emotional abuse, neglect, war, terrorism, and political violence, victim and witness of domestic violence, death of a parent, child, or caregiver, victim and witnesses of bullying. And then I have, kind of the top three that we see most in communities of color are historical trauma, community trauma, and vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma can also be known as secondary trauma. That is the trauma experienced by either individuals or groups of individuals that are witnesses to the trauma of others. So you can see vicarious trauma or experience vicarious trauma if you are a teacher, because you are taking care of children that might be coming in from traumatic backgrounds. Also as a member of faith-based communities, if you're a pastor or a member of clergy, and you're dealing with your congregation and all the things that they're bringing to you, you can begin to have a trauma response from all of the traumas of other individuals that you are either treating, taking care of, or teaching or exposed to. So that's why I wanted to put the asterisk between those things. And then also community trauma, that means really any community. It can be communities of color. It can be communities of refugees. It can be communities of, blue-haired, freckled-faced people. So those are communities. And, those are kind of the three big things that really impact entire groups of people. Then when you have all those three things working together, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Juneteenth. And so, Juneteenth, you have the historical trauma of slavery, the community trauma of the repercussions of that. We can go through you know, a number of, we can go through Jim Crow laws, civil rights movements, you know, all those things right up until, you know, June 19th of 2021. And then you have vicarious trauma of communities that have experienced that. So they are not in those original situations, but they have been witness to the impact and the repercussions of that. So that's just important to keep in mind for all populations, but particularly when you're talking about children and youth, because of the brain development, and your brain is developing up until you're about 27 years old. And when you're looking at stress and trauma and mental illness, all of those things are impacting how a young person mind is developing, and also how they're showing up in their classrooms, you know, to the basketball teams or community centers, to Sunday school, all of those things. And lastly, I believe this is my last slide, and then we're going to pass the baton to Dr. Dayna Long. These are just some of the kind of effects of trauma. And again, I did talk about that people experience it differently. And, you know, one person's response is not going to be another's. So we have nightmares and flashbacks, insomnia, self-destructive behaviors. And self-destructive behaviors can be a number of things, and it's going to look different for everyone. Self-destructive behaviors can be anything from poor eating habits, also to self-harm and suicidal ideation. So there's a broad spectrum of that. So look at your young people and, you know, your young adults, and if you recognize destructive behaviors, and again, that's going to be different for everyone. Maybe they're just drinking soda all the time and, you know, they're diabetic. That's not something that the young person should be doing. That's just a, you know, a minor example. Being emotionally overwhelmed, loss of interest in routine activities, hypervigilance, shame, and hatred. Hypervigilance, when I started teaching years ago, I used to teach in a special education classroom. And so all of the youth there had what we call a serious emotional disturbance. And in my early years, you know, when you go to teacher school, they don't teach you how to manage stress and trauma of the children and youth in your classrooms. They teach you that if you have a good lesson plan, that cures all. It does not. And when you have a classroom full of special education children that have histories of chronic stress and trauma, and I put the young person with the most physical abuse in the front of the classroom, and then I mark points off of them for behavior because they're always turned around, I am causing extra stress on that young person. So now that I know that this young person is hypervigilant because of the abuse that they have experienced, I sit them in the back of the classroom so that they can see everything that's happening in the classroom, so that their anxiety goes down, their stress goes down, and they feel like they're now in better control of what can or can't happen to them, because they're not looking behind them wondering, what is the person behind me doing? I also stopped hovering over children, because if you have had instances where adults in close proximity have caused you harm, they don't want me standing next to their desk. I might tap the desk and say, can I review this work with you? Is that okay? Or do you want to leave your desk and go to the table? But not knowing those things, I inadvertently triggered a number of children and youth and had a disproportionate response, because I am redirecting what I initially thought was a behavioral disruption, when it was really a trauma response to what I did while I'm trying to teach them. So that's very important in every setting, not just a classroom. And one last thing I want to say, because, you know, I remember growing up and my parents saying, oh, go give a hug to so-and-so, or go, you know, go give a handshake to so-and-so. Please don't force children to give physical contact. If a child doesn't want to give a hug and we're forcing them to give a hug to people, it doesn't matter who it is, even if the person is safe, we are letting them know that even if they don't feel comfortable, their bodies are subject to other people's pleasure. If giving someone a hug makes the other person feel good and it makes the child feel bad, and we are enforcing that, that sends a message that no matter how uncomfortable you are, you're going to engage in this physical contact with this person because I said so. So just being careful, you know, of that as well. And I think that is all of my time. Oh, one last thing here. I did talk about this already, so I'm not going to go deep into it. But the some of the things that can be a result if chronic stress and trauma is not managed, it can lead into some of those other mental health challenges that I spoke about earlier. And these are just some of those things: depression, anxiety, higher risk of suicide, and then also those physical challenges of high blood pressure, heart disease, and risk of stroke. So thank you all. And that is indeed my last slide. And I'm going to stop my screen share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that impactful and powerful presentation. You gave us a lot to consider, a lot to think about. And we really appreciate those tips and techniques as it relates to how to engage our children in connection with even others that may be family members or outside. So I think very, very provocative. As our Pastor Emeritus would say, you certainly made that plain for us. So thank you for that. All right, so next on our speaker presentation panel, we have Dr. Dayna Long. Dr. Dayna is a pediatrician and leader in child health equity. She is a professor of clinical pediatrics at the UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Long has been a primary care pediatrician at UCSF, Benioff Children's Hospital, for over 20 years. For the past 5 years, she served as co-director of the Center for Child and Community Health. And the mission of the CCCH Community Health Center is to be a positive force for all children. And the goal is to live full, vibrant, and healthy lives. Dr. Long accomplishes this mission through clinical transformation, health equity science, and systems leadership. And she literally has dedicated her career to eliminate childhood inequities that lead to poor health, financial, and educational outcomes for families and young children on both the individual and the population health levels. A little bit more information about Dr. Long is she leads numerous research studies on health adversity, trauma, and resiliency. And I'm looking forward to our her comments around resiliency and also our discussion as we have the panel talk. She's a co-principal investigator of the Pediatrics Adverse Childhood and Resilience Study, or better known as PEARLS. And the PEARLS tool screens and measures children for experiences in their daily environment that puts them at risk for toxic stress. So Dr. Dayna Long, we pass the baton to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Cynthia. And those last two presentations were so rich and so informative. So thank you to the other presenters. So today I want to add to the Sorry, you can't hear me. Can you guys hear me now? Awesome. So those last two presentations were so informative. And today I want to add to the conversation by just providing a framework for how do we think about the trauma that you just heard about. And that framework are called ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. I want folks to understand that when we talk about these experiences aren't just in our heads, right? These experiences get underneath our skin, they impact our biology. And just like they can get underneath our skin and flip switches on, we also have the amazing ability to flip the switches off. And this is where resiliency comes in. And we're going to talk about some strategies to build resiliency. through the last year and a half with COVID and the immense amount of historical trauma that we have faced as a people, I know that sometimes I can feel overwhelmed. And when I do, I remember what is my personal responsibility and then what is my responsibility to my community. And so I just want to share this quote that my responsibilities as an individual amount to a series of micro-revolutionary acts of love. And I hold on to this quote because every day when we are blessed to rise and to greet the day, I think, what am I doing to not only make my community better, my family better, but how am I actually attending to self and sort of manifesting this radical kind of love? There is this bold call of action that is being put forth by myself and the Surgeon General in California to really reduce, to cut exposure to ACEs, trauma, adversity, and toxic stress in half by 1 generation. This is a bold vision, and I think that we can accomplish it if we are all working together towards this common goal so that our children can all be healthier. So the framework for trauma that I want to talk about is really based upon this landmark study that took place. It was sponsored by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, California, in the mid-1990s, where they actually asked 17,000 adults, and these were mostly adult men, mostly white men, to reflect on their experiences that happened when they were children prior to the age of 18. And what they found that was actually groundbreaking is that the experiences that we have in children are related to our physical health, our mental health, and our behavioral health, and that there's a dose-dependent accumulation between adversities early on in life and then poor health outcomes as adults. And those poor health outcomes expand from physical health outcomes such as hypertension, cancer, obesity, diabetes, to mental health, depression and anxiety, to behavioral health, engaging in substance abuse or having multiple sexual partners. And ultimately, they created 10 categories within 3 domains for what they refer to as these early childhood experiences. And those 3 domains, like you just heard, are abuse, neglect, and household challenges. Now, household challenges is the broadest category. And it is inclusive of growing up in a household where a caregiver is incarcerated, where there's mental illness of a caregiver, where there's substance dependence, where there's absence of a caregiver due to separation or divorce, or whether there's intimate partner violence. When we are experiencing these ACEs or these adversities, what we can see is we can think of it as a bucket. Throughout our lives, we all carry around these buckets on our back. And every single experience in life, both positive and negative, are drops in our bucket, right? The positive experiences are drops that keep our buckets upright. The negative experiences are experiences that fill our buckets. And eventually, if we have enough of the accumulation of those drops, our buckets can tip over. The switches can flip up, and then that's what leads to these poor health outcomes. And those drops in the bucket are inclusive of abuse, neglect, or issues of household challenges. The research that I lead at Children's Hospital Oakland focused on children and very young children. So we enrolled children in a study, and they were between the ages of 0 up to their 11th birthday. And the average age of our children were between 5 and 6 years of age. And what we found is that even very young children, when they had experienced adversity, abuse, neglect, household challenges, they were already from a very young age manifesting a lot of what we refer to as somatic complaints. Somatic complaints are stomach aches, more headaches, missed days of school, and that their caregivers perceived their health as being poor than children who did not suffer from adversity. And those children that had 4 or more ACEs by the average age of 5 or 6 already were 2 to 3 times more likely to have asthma and 33 times more likely to have learning and behavioral concerns. Now, this is profound because this is exactly what we're seeing on the playground and in the classroom, is that children that are experiencing adversity have a harder time managing that prefrontal cortex, managing that hippocampus, and it manifests itself and shows up by having difficulties learning, difficulties controlling their impulsive behavior, difficulties attending and being successful in the classroom. And when these children become adults, what we see is that they are 2 times more likely to have heart disease or cancer, 3 times more likely to have asthma, emphysema, COPD, almost 5 times more likely to have depression, 10 times more likely to engage in substance abuse, 37 times more likely to attempt suicide, and have 9 out of 10 of the leading causes of death when they have experienced 4 or more ACEs prior to the age of 18. This is sobering. This is why we want to shout to the rooftops, right? That our job as individuals and as community members is to prevent the exposure of trauma to our children and cut it in half by 1 generation. This is pre-COVID data from the California Department of Public Health, Injury and Violence that looked at the prevalence of ACEs in California. And what this data says is that at least 32% of Californians have experienced at least 1 adversity, and 16% have experienced 4 or more. This data is not representative or inclusive of large populations of people of color or low income populations. And so when we looked at the same type of prevalence data within our clinic in Oakland, what we found is that amongst our average age of 5 to 6-year-olds, over 70% of them already had experienced 1 significant adversity, and almost 50% had already experienced, by the average age of 5 or 6, 4 or more types of adversity. Beyond abuse, neglect, and household challenges, there are other related life events that also can lead to this toxic stress physiology that you heard about, right? Some of those related life events are not having enough food, not having stable housing, violence in communities, including police violence, and racism and discrimination. Racism is a core determinant of health. Racism, just like other forms of trauma, it gets underneath our skin. It affects our hearts, our minds, and our bodies. Exposure to racism has been linked to birth disparities. It's been linked to mental health concerns. And on a biologic level, what we now are learning is that racism can impact us to the level of our cells. And we see this impact across the life spectrum. And so what we do know is that Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. We know that Black babies, this blows my mind, right? That Black babies are 3 times more likely to die compared to white babies when they're cared for by white doctors. We know that for children, that children are 5 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital for asthma, that Black children are 2.5 times less likely to read at grade level proficiency, and that as we grow, that Black adults are almost 2 times more likely to be unemployed, 7 times more likely to be incarcerated, and 2 times more likely to live in poverty. Racism is structural. Racism also has impacts that lead to African Americans being more likely to die at all ages from all causes compared to our white peers. And so if you look at chronic diseases across the country, right, we're more likely to have high blood pressure, we're more likely to have diabetes, we're more likely to die from cardiovascular incidences and have strokes. And what we are now learning is that it's the accumulation of stress that leads to these dose-dependent correlations with poor health outcomes, and that ACEs have health-associated conditions such as being diabetic or having high blood pressure, being obese, or having cardiovascular disease. There's just two quotes that I want to share with you, and one is from an amazing book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome that says, although slavery has long been a part of human history, American slavery represents a case of human trauma incomparable in scope, duration, consequence to any other incidents of human enslavement. And just to reinforce that there's nothing inherent about Black skin that causes us to have more chronic disease, aside from the overexposure to racism. And lastly, Professor Dr. Ken Hardy said that racial oppression is a form of traumatic interpersonal violence, which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. This is all related to stress. And you just heard from Lisa that there are 3 types of stress. And what I want to add to that conversation is this understanding of how this stress is getting underneath our skin and truly affecting our hearts, our minds, and our bodies. And so positive stress is, as Lisa said, it's where you have to maybe take a test or try out for the soccer team. And what happens on a biologic level is that you do see increases in stress hormones. Those hormones are cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine. It's what allows you to either fight, to flight, to run away, or to freeze, right? And so if that pit bull or that bear is coming towards you, these stress hormones allow you to fight that bear, to run away from that bear, or just to freeze so the bear won't see you. With positive stress, the bear leaves and you get back to a place of homeostasis or regulation calm. Tolerable stress is more serious stress, but it is temporary as long as that child or that individual is surrounded by buffering, safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. They can experience that stress, a big move, going to a new school, the death of a grandparent. And due to the safe, stable, nurturing relationships and protective factors in our environment, the flip comes back down, you get to a place of homeostasis and balance. Toxic stress is when you have this prolonged activation of the stress response. And so flight, fight, and freeze, it's chronic, it's constant in the absence of safe, stable, protective relationships. And this is the key. We can be exposed to very adverse situations. And if we have that adult who's in our corner, who is always there for us, we can actually get back to homeostasis. But it's what happens when that bear is there all the time without having resilient protective factors surrounding that child. So another way to think about it is that we are all sort of born, right? And we experience things in our life. We experience these early life adversities. And then it's a balance between our predisposing vulnerabilities, our makeup, our genetic factors, and these protective factors that determine whether or not we will develop toxic stress. There can be a child who is born into a very traumatic environment, and they have that grandparent, that teacher, that coach, that church that is always there for them, right? That is providing the safety and resilience that they need, and they won't have clinical manifestations of that stress. Some of the type of clinical manifestations that we see are genetic. Stress and trauma can be passed down from generations. Once that switch is flipped up, it can change the way that our genetic code is read, And then those alterations get passed down to our babies and across generations. Historic trauma, it's in our DNA and it can get passed on. And what we need to figure out at this point of time is, how do we actually flip that switch back down so that we can disrupt this intergenerational switch that is currently flipped up? We can also see changes in our endocrine system, which is why all of a sudden we didn't have diabetes, that switch got turned on, and now we have diabetes or hypertension or depression or a chronically inflamed immune system that leads to our asthma being very poorly controlled. Right? This expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water and get wet, right? We all have experienced historical trauma from the time that our ancestors got on those slave ships. Many of our children are being exposed to ongoing trauma. And so now the question that we all need to wrestle with is, how do we actually stop getting wet? How do we flip the switches off? Just like we talked about toxic stress gets underneath our skin, so does resiliency, right? And the definition of resiliency that I choose to use is that resiliency is really this ability to withstand or recover from stressors. And it results from a combination of factors such as creating safe, stable, nurturing relationships with family members and other caring adults, as well as a predisposing biologic susceptibility, our ability to maintain homeostasis and calm, right? And so it's, how are we actually absorbing that stress? How are we responding to it? And I really want to stress that the science is helping us understand that we have to actually think about resilience as having effects on our neuroendocrine, immune, and genetic factors so that we can actually protect health and make sure that we don't develop those poor health outcomes. What do I mean? What do I mean when I say safe, stable, and nurturing, right? Safe, stable, and nurturing are three really critical qualities of relationships and environments that enable children to thrive. And so safety, it means the extent to which a child is free from fear and secure from harm. And that harm might be physical harm or psychological harm. Stability is the degree of predictability and consistency in a child's life. And nurturing, this is what Dr. Carina was talking about. Nurturing is the extent to which a child's needs are met on a sensitive and consistent basis. Safe, stable, and nurturing help to buffer the consequences of toxic stress so that it does not get underneath our skin. A mentor of mine said that talking about trauma opens the door to healing. People want to be seen, known, and understood. Sometimes we take the longer, short road. It's Juneteenth. We are talking about trauma. We are talking about the intergenerational effects of that trauma, how it's getting passed from one generation to the next. And a way to disrupt that is by talking, right? Is by saying how it is affecting us. And sometimes it takes time that we have to invest in our family and our community. But by taking the time, we can actually help to secure the future for generations of children. There are evidence-based strategies that can help us to regulate our stress response. And honestly, it doesn't have to be complicated all the time. So if we can focus on each of these 7 strategies for a minute, right? The first is supportive relationships, which means that not only do we have to focus on staying connected to our immediate family, but that we stay connected to community. Quality sleep has a great impact on our health, and creating sleep routines, right? That we go to bed at 9 or 10 and we wake up at, whatever time it is, 5, 6, 7 in the morning, but that we hold on to having routines, that we focused on balanced nutrition. And it's not about dieting, it's understanding that when we have a toxic stress physiology, when our cortisol level is high, when we have high levels of adrenaline, our bodies crave sugar and processed food because our bodies know that I might need to fight this bear, or I might need to run. I need to eat all these carbs and all this sugar so that my body has energy, right? And so part of regulating the toxic stress system is understanding that there is no bear right now. I'm craving these high fat, high sugar foods because my body is maladaptive. And that by making sure that we're focused on fruits, vegetables, and protein, we can prevent the diabetes from kicking in. We can prevent the blood pressure from being high, understanding that food itself is medicine and fuel. Physical activity, it doesn't mean that you have to go for a run every single day, but it means that you move your body, right? That you make sure you go for walks, or that you download that YouTube or TikTok video that gets you dancing. Mindfulness practices are really broad. Some people meditate. It might be that you take time to pray. It might be that you take time just to clear your mind. There's this notion of being with, right? Being with ourselves and practicing radical self-love means that we attend to our own needs, because if we attend to our own needs, we'll be much more regulated to attend to the people around us. There is a lot of scientific literature that has shown that being out in nature, whether this is your backyard or hiking on a trail, can actually bring down our levels of cortisol. It brings down our blood pressure. Nature can bring down our heart rates. So making sure that we're getting out into nature. And then attending to our mental health is critical. Reach out for help. It might be that you get that help from a friend, or that you consult with your primary care doctor. You get a referral to therapy, but attending to our mental health is just as important as attending to our physical health. I wanted to give more examples of protective factors and what we can do so that we're not just talking about trauma in a vacuum, right? And these protective factors are being able to recognize emotions. We are leading group visits for caregivers and children within my clinic, and these are young children. And what we found is that even very young children, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, they're able to name where their emotions lie in their body. And so that I've been able to have, some of my young patients say that when I feel angry, it's in my hand and then I hit. So being able to name where emotions are and doing these body scans is really important. When I feel stressed, it's in my head and I get a headache. Relationships, to encourage connecting with friends and classmates, making sure that we're calling family members, maintain structure and routines, to exercise, and then to make sure that we're connected to something bigger than ourselves. The faith-based community is a great place to connect. You can also connect to nature or social justice organizations. Lastly, I want to share this beautiful picture by the artist Kadir Nelson, and he actually drew this at the beginning of the pandemic. It's called After the Storm, and you can see that all of these people are aligned and looking in the same direction towards this vision of health and healing. And it really is a triumphant celebration of humanity and determination, faith and solidarity. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. And Cynthia, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dayna Long. We really, really appreciate your presentation and your passion around this most important subject matter. Well, we have heard just some incredible information. We've heard some tips and some tools for us to consider. And I know our amazing participants out there in the audience have a lot of thoughts and reflections. And of course, we're focusing on childhood trauma and this notion of Juneteenth and what that represents in this space, because it certainly, while we're celebrating on one hand in this country, we also know that this represents a traumatic, tremendously traumatic and foundational experience for us as Black people in this country. So that being said, I want to shift our attention just a bit to focus on our basically discussion and to hear questions from those of you that are in the audience. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce another one of our panel discussants or participants, and that would be Nathaniel Goodlow III. Nate, if you would unmute yourself, I want to just share a little bit about Nate's background. Nathaniel Goodlow III is 18-year-old sophomore at the University of Arizona. Nate is really passionate about his community as well as his church, and we are so very proud of this young man, having watched him grow up in the Allen Temple Baptist Church. Nate is a youth worship leader at Allen Temple and a junior deacon at Allen Temple as well. So join me in welcoming and celebrating our wonderful youth representative, Nathaniel Goodlow, to be a panel participant in today's childhood trauma discussion. Thank you for being with us, Nate. I wanted to just start out our panel discussion by having you, Nate, just share as a young person. We've heard a lot in both Dr. Carina, Miss Lisa, as well as Dr. Dayna's presentations around this subject matter. And I'm curious how these presentations basically have connected with you, what stuck with you from your own personal perspective. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think also I want to thank the presenters for presenting today. Those were very wonderful, well thought out presentations. And what really stuck with me was how connected everything is. Everything you experience in your life is connected, and it may come back later on, and everything works for a reason. Those things those different parts of the brain that were discussed, I've never studied or learned about those things. So it was really informative to hear those different things and explaining that each part of the brain has a different function. Yeah, so those were very, very informative, and I enjoyed listening to each of you speak today.
Thank you so much, Nate. We appreciate those kind and thoughtful comments. So we've already started receiving some questions from individuals that some wanted to remain anonymous, some are in the chat. And of course, we have some general questions that we'd also like to raise. So let's get to it. I wanted to first raise the questions for all the parents and grandparents that are out there, to our panel participants. How would you say that parents and grandparents can best equip their children? We've heard a lot about the impact of stress. You talked about the levels of stress, the positive, the tolerable, and certainly the toxic levels of stress. And we know what's happening with social media. It's driving a lot of our kids, frankly, and what I'm seeing, almost insane. They're comparing themselves to the pictures and the stories that they're seeing from friends or folks that they don't know. And of course, COVID and its impact on our young people. I think that the stories, the research that we're going to be hearing in years to come is going to be something that will be challenging for all of us to consider. So my question is, how do parents, grandparents, guardians, aunts and uncles best equip our children in this kind of culture that we're living in? And any of our panelists can unmute themselves, and we'd love to hear from you.
I'll take a quick stab at it. You know, I get this question, I think maybe 2 or 3 times a week, particularly because of what's happening with the pandemic. And, you know, I truly believe that the first step is for, you know, parents and grandparents to equip themselves, you know, be aware of what young people are exposed to. Not saying that you have to be on social media knowing what's happening, but, you know, be aware that particularly with social media and what we've seen in isolation is we've really seen more isolation with our children and youth. and to, you know, I have an 11-year-old here at home, and I regulate his electronics. That can be a step one. I can't stop him from accessing everything, but it's easy for, you know, parents and caregivers to, particularly during COVID, to make allowances for those type of artificial connections that we wouldn't have done 2 or 3 years ago. And those artificial connections have real consequences for our children and youth. And they are measuring their self-worth and self-esteem from external relationships that don't really exist in reality, but they exist in virtual reality. My son uses all type of acronyms I have to Google all the time. He's got VR friends. I said, what is that? Well, virtual reality. What? Like, these aren't your friends. These are people with avatars and initials, and you don't know. And if they put something in the chat, he gets upset about it. And I have to go re-regulate him. You know, imagine that with you know, middle school and high schoolers. So I think first, just being aware and equipping yourself with the realities of the impact that outside influences are having on our children and youth, particularly with you know, these devices. And I got, you know, 5 or 6 more I can, you know, show you in the house. But being aware of that, and then also I think it's really important to not ignore any changes in behavior, or not write off a reaction that young people are having to either something on social media or their friends, and saying, well, it's not a real relationship. Why are you reacting, you know, so much? Really look into that. I'm just going to pause there. I know my colleagues may have other insights.
Well, go ahead, Dayna.
Okay, briefly, and then Carina, is that what we have learned from the science, and I always bring it back to sort of what is evidence-based, is the consistency of having a grandparent is actually what is most important when we think about how to buffer the effects of trauma. And so that guiding presence, that grandparent who's always checking in with a kid, and even if the teenager doesn't want to respond, just that they know that you're there, is hugely important to sort of their future health. And so I understand that social media, my kids are always on their iPad, their laptops, their phones. And yet every day I check in. How are you doing? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling happy? Are you feeling joyful? Are you curious? It's critical to their development.
Carina, did you have additional comments?
Yeah, I wish you, Dayna, could show us one more time that wheel that you had at the end, one of the last slides, because I was just thinking that if you walk through that wheel, you can pick out whatever works. Different things work for different people, like Lisa was saying many times. I think it's so true. If you go through and pick out something from each one, or something from some of them, you're already doing a lot. You're doing a lot. You could work on your kids' sleep. You could think of fun ways to have better nutrition in the house. You could cook together. If you cook together, then you have balanced nutrition and a supportive relationship, because now you're combining cooking with love. Isn't that smart? You can take a hike outside. You can take a walk. Now you're combining supportive relationship with access to nature. So I love your wheel, because it gives me so many ideas, and all of them are stress busters. I think it's great.
I just want to second you, Carina, that we know that these 7 stress busters work. And so creating daily action plans, and you can pick and choose. Today, I'm going to focus on mindfulness as a parent or a grandparent, and making sure that I am regulated, right? Like, we have to think about ourselves as adults as we are the hands, right? We are the hands that provide safety, and our children need to know that we delight in them, that we are the place of love and joy and comfort. And in order to be open hands for our kids, it might be that today we're focusing on our mindfulness. Tomorrow, we're focusing on going for that hike or that walk, or that we're going to make lunch together. And we're going to make sure that that lunch is medicinal, right? So that we are getting our fruits, our vegetables, our vitamins, and not responding to the drive for cortisol to need the French fries and the pizza.
Very, very thoughtful. Thank you all. Nate, I'm curious in terms of as a young person, you've heard a lot from our experts. What do you think as a young person in terms of how parents can and grandparents can best equip young persons like yourself and younger folks as well?
I think Dr. Lisa said earlier that you must educate yourself as a parent or grandparent to these social media, the different things that come out, because they change every day almost. The new site that people are using, and you have to understand that there's good to social media and bad to social media, and you can't ignore the good and only focus on the bad, and ignore the bad and only focus on the good. But you should disconnect yourself and teach them to disconnect themselves from the social media. They can be on it, they can have it, post, but you don't want to see yourself as connected to that social media and what goes on in the social media world, which is something that I personally experienced over this last year. I've become really disconnected from my social media because I haven't had much to post because we weren't going anywhere or doing much. So I haven't had any reason to be on social media all the time. So I've become really disconnected from it, and it has caused me to feel more in the now and what's going on here and now, where I'm at and what I'm doing in my life, as opposed to worrying about everyone else and what's going on there and here and there. So I think that's really important, to make sure that young people understand that you can be on it and engage in it, but do not connect yourself to it. Do not let it internalize within you and have your own self-image and your vision of yourself be connected to what you see on social media.
Words to the wise. My goodness. Thank you for sharing those thoughts also, Nate. So I want to raise a question that I think is one that is tremendously important. All questions are important, but I want to call this one out. I'm going to read the question. My adult children have acknowledged their choices of mates, and they say they reflect the violence I allowed their father to inflict on them when they were growing up. One child was in a physically violent relationship. The other is in a mentally abusive relationship. I've become defensive and depressed. What should we do? Experts, how would you respond?
So I can take a stab at this. And I think that we think about health as prevention, right? And treatment. And when we think about prevention, there's primary prevention, such as how do we keep ourselves healthy so that we don't get sick? Secondary prevention, right? Which is that there's some, like I might have obesity, and what do I need to do to prevent that from becoming diabetes, right? Tertiary prevention is that, you know, I've been smoking for 30 years. I don't yet have lung cancer, but I know that I'm super at risk. And then there's treatment. If there's a recognition of, from the person who asked the question, of being defensive and depression, the first thing is to seek help, right? That they need to actually at that point come to their primary care doctor, get a referral for mental health services, and attend to what they need to be healthy. And then in terms of supporting that person's children, it's about the recommendation of being there and the offering of resources so that they themselves can get to a better place, which might involve attending to their mental health, their physical health, and their behavioral health.
Thank you, Dr. Dayna. Dr. Grandison, Lisa, any comments?
I want to first acknowledge the courage it took to put that question, out there and to be vulnerable. And so, thank you for putting that there. And, this is some of that generational trauma that we all touched on earlier. And, as Dr. Dayna said, it's very important to get care for yourself. And, I say this all the time, flat tires don't fix themselves. You have to make sure that you get the appropriate resources and support to manage your health and wellness so that you can begin to show a different example, for your family as well. Self-care is very important. And showing that, when you're ready, I'm not suggesting that you get your mental health services going and then immediately share that with your children. But I am saying that part of showing an example is also showing an example of self-care. And as you're engaging in treatment, hopefully you will develop some strategies and some coping mechanisms that you can model for your family as well.
I so agree with what the two speakers said. I would just add that, this is the condition of the human family. I think if we asked people, everybody who participates to do some kind of checklist of adverse events, adverse situations, there would be tallies in everybody's columns. So this person was brave enough to speak of the tallies in their column of the stresses in their lives. We used to think, like Lisa was saying earlier, that there is absence of problem or absence of mental disorder and mental disorder. It is so not like that. I think if we all asked ourselves and sat down and would write down the things that are hard in our families, we would all have lists. The question is then, what do you do with it? You have to think about it, you have to talk about it, you have to study it, you have to seek support. It's a process. It's not that you go from bad to good in a snap. It takes a long time to improve upon our conditions. And I think all the ways in which we have spoken about today, all of those ways, including in this particular person's situation, therapy to process what's going on is the way forward.
Reverend Cynthia, I have one more thing to add, and I put it in the
Please.
chat. And so Dr. Burke-Harris and some other funders and stakeholders such as myself have put together a website. It's called Number Story. You can click on it. I put it in the link. And on the Number Story, there is a section about getting help right now for someone that is actually in crisis. And if you click on the Get Help Right Now, there is the phone number for crisis resources. That includes the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, the Domestic Violence Hotline, the Child Abuse Prevention Hotline. And then there's also a link you can click on, strategies you can use right now about getting grounded, shaking it off, about taking a deep breath and belly breathing. I often feel as if I'm very practical. And so if people need help right now, that's a place to refer them to get the phone numbers and the resources that they need.
Thank you all. Thank you so much also for those resources, Dr. Long. If you could, to all our panelists, if you're open to it, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat a way that any of our participants might be able to either email you a question or something of that nature, and you're willing to have them receive that information from you, I think it would be wonderful. We are all about here at Allen Temple how to gather resources to help our community, help our congregants, help people as a whole. And so that would be really helpful for us from a resource perspective. We also have our Visalia Counseling Center. And of course, we have wonderful counselors that are engaged there that can also be of support to our congregants and community as a whole. I know we're running short on time. We've got about 5 minutes, and we made a promise earlier that we would honor your time and end on time. But I did want to raise another, I think, poignant question that from a couple sources, it's been reworded, but in essence, this is the question. So we've heard and we know historically a lot about the trauma that we've experienced as a people, and certainly we know the impact that it's had on us individually and our families and collectively as a community. But how do you feel about the realities of hope in what we know as an overexposed generation of youth? We know that our young people today are raised much differently, let's say, than any of us are and have been on this call. It's just a totally different generation. So where is the hope? And then how do we protect our youth? This is a three-part question. And what is the role of the faith community in this important space? So a couple things. Is there hope in this overexposed generation? How do we protect our children? And what's the role of the faith-based community in partnership with you experts?
That's such a juicy topic, and I'm gonna get a little academic here because of some current research that I am doing on two things: servant leadership as a paradigm, and then also spiritual leadership as an organizational framework. And for spiritual leaders within the faith-based community, part of the spiritual leadership paradigm, it has 6 dimensions, and the 3 that I want to make sure that are applicable are that faith and hope dimension, the altruistic love, which is happiness, and then also the membership portion of that theory. And with faith-based leaders, it's important to always hold on to hope with every generation. I think maybe every generation has said this generation is different. So I think that statement is not unique. The world is different, but it's always different in every generation. And for faith-based leaders, it is important to, and faith-based communities, it's important to offer in other resources that may be able to speak to some of the things that you're seeing in children and youth. Not that there isn't expertise within the church, not that there isn't power in prayer, but, and I think I said this to a group of pastors maybe a month or so ago, are you praying for the situation to fix itself, or are you praying for the provisions and guidance and resources to help you facilitate something, the healing? So within, church, hold on to hope, and within your faith-based communities, it's important to also equip your faith-based leaders and, by virtue of your congregation, with access to all types of resources and exposure to a number of things, as Dr. Dayna, suggested, those practical things that they can tap into. And yes, there is hope. Faith is built on hope. And if you lose that, then faith is dwindling. We can't afford that as a community, as a spiritual community, as a community of color, as a human condition. We always have to be hopeful that we can impact those that we can touch. So I feel like I'm dipping into a sermon, so I'm going to mute.
I just want to second, Lisa, what you just said is that faith is built on hope. And we talked about adverse childhood experiences, but there also are positive childhood experiences that influence our health and well-being. You heard about the children in the orphanage. There's a large body of work called Angels in the Nursery. And these angels were individuals that provided love and hope to babies. And those babies grew up and they thrived. Being able to recall times that the grandparent or the mother sat in the bed and read with you, or where you danced around and listened to music, or where you went and you got outside and went camping. Those experiences actually carry us through, and hope balances out adversity every single time.
Thank you.
I think there was one of you who had a really cool slide that said something about micro acts, micro something. And that just, came to my mind when you were talking about the big picture, because there's the macro hope and there's the micro hope. I think the little acts that we do every day, are we doing something that makes somebody else feel a little better? That's what I'm trying to think about every day. Am I contributing to somebody's problem, or am I contributing to some kind of solution for somebody? That's what guides my work every day.
Thank you. Thank you all for those responses. I saw somebody typed in the chat, they can clearly see a symposium part 2. So I think that we've just tapped the surface in terms of just the continued dialogue and engagement with our experts and with our youth, and really continue to drill down in terms of what we can do as a group and together to make an impact. I am so pleased to have been able to be a part of this wonderful symposium. Thank you so much, Deacon Michael Perrilliat and your team. Thank you, Pastor Jacqueline Thompson. Thank all of you for taking time out in your busy schedules on a Saturday to join us for just this important topic on Juneteenth of all days, right? And literally, we are now a national holiday. So let's go out and make a difference in showing our love to ourselves, to our family members, and please don't forget our young, our children, and our youth. Deacon Michael Perrilliat, any closing words?
Wow. Great presentations, very powerful, informative, and empowering. And I just want to thank each of our presenters, Dr. Carina Grandison, Sister Lisa Carlisle, Dr. Dayna Long, and I want to thank my wife, the Reverend Cynthia Carter, for agreeing to act as the moderator today. Very rich and powerful. I want to thank Deacon Harold Goodman for helping me as a think partner as we were actually trying to develop this symposium. And so I'm so thankful for each and every one of you, and for all of you participants who have taken out time out of your very busy day to be a part of this very important subject matter. So thank you. Thank you
for that, Deacon Michael. And certainly, last but not least, we want to highlight our youth. And so I wanted to say, Reverend Dr., whatever you want to be, Nathaniel Goodlow III, we are all about it. And we are in this with you and your contemporaries, not just now, but we're making a commitment for life. So pass the word.
Thank you all.
So very welcome. All right, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us. We love you all.
Bye. Take care.
God bless. Bye-bye.